We are Rogue Media Sports.
All right, it is Doomsday Podcast, emergency podcast. And Ed Werder, the news has come down. We've been monitoring this from all over. You've talked to your sources today, but news comes that Mike McCarthy's time in Dallas has ended. The two parted ways. And again, the confusing part of all of this, Ed, is the fact that, you know, the reporting seems to suggest that, well, they never got around to talking about a contract, which I find very hard to believe that.
Well,
Yes.
Matt, Jerry Jones just put out a statement.
Yes.
In which he basically confirms that they did not reach that point. I'll read it. Throughout Mike McCarthy's tenure here, including the last several weeks, I have been very complimentary of the job he has done. That has applied to our record over that time period, our team unity and culture, Mike's qualifications and track record of success, and on a personal level as a tremendous human being. I have great respect for Mike, and he has led the team through some very unique and challenging times during his tenure. Over the past week, Mike and I had the opportunity to conduct a joint review of all aspects of the past season, our players and staff, and also spent considerable time discussing the road forward for the team. These discussions were thorough and received an appropriate amount of time and depth to cover. Prior to reaching the point of contract negotiations, though, it became mutually clear that it would be better for each of us to head in different directions. I thank Mike and wish him, his wife Jessica, and their family the best. They have been a wonderful part of our community here. We will commence a search process immediately to hire the next head coach of the Dallas Cowboys. So Jerry Jones confirming that despite spending an entire week after their 7-10 season was concluded, they did not get to the point to begin negotiating an extension of Mike's contract, and instead decided to go their separate ways.
And you and I are both trained to with Jerry. I mean, we can't take everything at face value, but this is what Jerry is confirming, the reports that suggest that they didn't get to that point. But it's wild, Ed, that at a time when Chicago was reportedly, asking for permission to talk to him, he was denying that. Cowboys at first didn't get back to them, and then they said, heck no. And so you would think if that was turned down, that the thought was that they were involved in negotiations. But apparently, Ed, they were just talking about the personnel, looking at that D-line, looking at the O-line, and just visiting, and then decided to go separate ways. I mean, my gut tells me that Mike got a whiff of, if he really wanted to stay, that Jerry was not going to do some kind of long-term contract like you and I have talked about. Like that Mike actually somehow gained leverage after going 7-10 this season. And we all know the reasons, and Dak was out, and you've documented that. 3 straight 12-win seasons. He's done really well when he's had Dak in play. But Ed, it seems like they just kind of lost a week here in the process. And as you and others have pointed out, they lost the shot to talk to some of these coaches that are still in the playoffs, like the Detroit staff, for instance.
Well, Jerry obviously knew that if he wanted to conduct a decision on the coaching staff, and it was going to require this amount of time, which has not been uncommon for him. He's done it before. He did it with Jason Garrett. It took a week. That he risked that other teams would act and hire candidates that he might have had interest in. We can speak to Bill Belichick deciding that he was not going to necessarily get a job offer in the NFL at a place he would desire, and so he signed with North Carolina to be a college head coach. Mike Vrabel was introduced today as the head coach of the New England Patriots. Those two, quite honestly, for me, last year, had Jerry made this decision, those would have been the two top guys on my list as potential replacements. So Jerry either must be comfortable with what's transpired, or he thinks that they can overcome this disadvantage because they're still behind 5 other teams in the process, because while the New England job has been filled, and all the requirements that the NFL, demands that protocols be followed in hiring a head coach, which includes, bringing in 2 minority candidates from outside your organization for interviews. That's going to take some time. And like you said, now if he wants to hire somebody off Detroit staff or he wants to hire somebody off Kansas City staff, the 2 number 1 seeded teams, he's going to have to wait until their seasons are over, which potentially could be in February after the Super Bowl. So, he's put himself at a huge disadvantage. My sense of it, since we talked to both principals here after they finished the season with the loss against Washington, it seemed very clear. Mike was unequivocal and very public about his first priority was his preferred destination was to remain in Dallas. And the fact that that didn't happen means that Jerry did not have that same enthusiasm, or Mike considered the scenario Jerry was creating for him, his terms, as being untenable. He does know, obviously, that he might have an opportunity in Chicago. I confirmed today they remain interested in him. I fully suspect the only reason the New Orleans Saints didn't put in a request was because they saw the Cowboys reject Chicago, so why should they bother with that formality? Just wait. And, Mike McCarthy, as we talked about long ago, I honestly think I was the first person to put McCarthy as potential having an opportunity, if not in Dallas, then in New Orleans, because he began his career as an offensive play caller with the Saints. And Mickey Loomis, the general manager, was there at the time. Mickey Loomis's son is in the Cowboys organization now in the scouting department as an executive. So Mickey can get unique insight into McCarthy. So I really think this ultimately was Jerry's decision more than it was Mike's. I think Mike wanted it to work, make it work. I think his family wanted to stay here. But ultimately, that's not the outcome. And I guess we shouldn't be shocked, because he didn't get extended after winning 12 games 3 years in a row. He was put in a circumstance of he and his entire staff having to work the final year of their contracts. Almost never happens in the NFL to Super Bowl winning coaches like McCarthy. And then when he went 7-10, despite the fact that there were all kinds of reasons for that, starting with Dak Prescott's injuries and all those on the defensive side of the ball and the bad roster they started the season with, obviously we all thought he was going to have to go to a NFC Championship game to keep his job, and they fell well short of that. He was hired to win a Super Bowl. That didn't happen. That's Jerry's justification.
That's interesting, because others think that Mike may have been the one to ultimately decide to leave. It may have been both of them, but that's an interesting point. I think Mike, Ed, was always, and he was willing to say it from the start of training camp. He said, this is uncomfortable. And, I think it kept coming up. I mean, it hung over him the entire last 8 games of the season after they were pretty much out of it already. And he did a pretty good job of keeping the team focused. At times, they actually played okay and won a few games with Cooper Rush. But, in the end, Dak Prescott or anybody that might have been lobbying for him couldn't get it done. Even we heard Troy Aikman at some point, late in the season say, I think, Mike McCarthy will be back with the Cowboys. But Jerry left the door open. And as you recall, you and I were both with Jerry after that game. And I said, do you have a list in case this thing doesn't work out? And before kind of making a joke about the Senior Bowl and mentioning like there's 500 coaches he could talk there.
An infamous number for Jerry.
A very infamous number, as you rightly pointed out. That was a moment where Jerry, before he got to that, he said there might be people that have Super Bowls on their resume, and on his list. And of course, when we think about that, Pete Carroll's name has been attached to some of these jobs. In fact, he's already interviewed with Chicago. John Gruden
interviewing with the Raiders today.
Yeah, had the Raiders today. John Gruden wants back in. And, John Gruden didn't just get fired for losing games. John Gruden got fired for some kind of controversy and some emails and, that whole thing that we don't need to rehash. But my point with Gruden, Ed, is like, I don't think Jerry basically tried to get the commissioner fired at one point. Like, if there's anybody in the league that's going to try to bring Gruden back in, I think Jerry wouldn't mind being the guy to do it. And I do think he wants to. He's gone headfirst into this Barstool relationship. Ed, you and I think, years ago, they interviewed the Doomsday podcast, but he's been right in the thick of all that, and he seems to be enjoying it. But I think he kind of thinks that if he's ever going to get back in, he really needs to do it now. And so I think there'll be all kinds of folks reaching out to Jerry, but the retread coach seems to be what Jerry's most comfortable with. But I'll put this back to you. You brought up the fact that Kellen Moore, and of course they won a playoff game and will proceed. And so it makes it, again, awkward to try to have an interview with him. But that's the only sort of up and coming assistant who hasn't been a head coach that kind of makes any sense with Jerry. And I think that's still the case.
Yeah. One final point on McCarthy is when I met with him after the game, after he did his last press conference, I got the very clear sense that he was frustrated, felt disrespected by being forced to work the final year of his contract, as we talked about, and that he was determined not to replicate that scenario again. And so if Jerry went into this thinking he could get McCarthy with a partial commitment and at a reduced salary or without giving him a significant raise, I'm pretty sure Mike was not going to accept those terms. And so maybe that's ultimately what drove them apart. But as far as moving forward and these other candidates, I think the only time Jerry can do anything. I mean, he's totally unpredictable. You can't rule anything out for a man who 30 years ago got rid of his two-time Super Bowl winning coach and Jimmy Johnson and brought in, of all people, Barry Switzer, who had never coached in the NFL and was 5 years retired from Oklahoma. And they won a Super Bowl with Jimmy's team, obviously. But still, the point is you can't predict what Jerry might do. Yeah, I think he could sell Pete Carroll. I think he could sell John Gruden. I don't think he'll love the fact that Gruden has a pending lawsuit against the NFL, which means he has a lawsuit against Jerry as part of it by extension. His character has certainly been questioned, if not assassinated, but Jerry's been through that himself. And so he may feel that that's not a big thing, that, it could be wrong, that part of it. Kellen Moore makes a ton of sense to me because Jerry prizes familiarity. He will want to hire somebody who's going to get the most out of Dak Prescott and be the least amount disruptive to the offense and Dak Prescott. And Kellen Moore was here as a player, a backup quarterback in the room with Dak Prescott, started his coaching career in Dallas, was the play caller that Jerry forced on McCarthy at the beginning of his time here. And I still think this all goes back to McCarthy losing the Green Bay game. And I think Jerry and Steven and Will McClay watching this first round of playoff games and seeing both the number 2 seeds, as the Cowboys were last year, win at home decisively and eliminate the 7 seeds, and realize that the only time in 10 games since the current playoff format was instituted that a 7 seed beat the number 2 seed was Green Bay beating Dallas last year. And beating them badly when the Cowboys had every advantage there ever was. The plus 172 point differential at home, the only undefeated team in the NFL at home, Green Bay's inexperience as the youngest team in football. All of that was reiterated to Jerry over the weekend. What a horrendous loss that was. And then you look at it, well, from that point forward, what happened? Well, they got blown out by a bad Saints team. They got a historic loss to Detroit. That's how far they are from being the number 1 seed. And so I think Jerry never got all of that out of his mind. And yeah, Kellen Moore, to me, makes perfect sense. He watched Kellen Moore win yesterday with a quarterback who'd been out for 3 weeks against the same Packer team. He watched Dan Quinn, who was on McCarthy's staff, be the only team to win on the road yesterday in the playoffs as a first-year coach. So, I think that this all goes back to the Green Bay loss. Jerry could never quite get over that. Maybe he shouldn't have. And where they go moving forward, I think there are a lot of options. I think Jerry's totally unpredictable in this aspect. I assume he has, as he said answered your question, He keeps a list of people that he has interest in. Ben Johnson, somebody who's, the Detroit offensive coordinator, is going to be the number one NFL assistant, turned down jobs last year to go back to Detroit, had an even better year, runs exactly the kind of offensive system the Cowboys need to be running now with Dak Prescott in terms of being under center and using play action passing. What Jared Goff does now is what Dak Prescott should be doing in his age 32 season and forward.
Boy, good stuff. And it's going to be fascinating to watch in these coming days. And, I was asked earlier today, Ed, like timetable, is Jerry going to move quickly? And again, it's hard to say with him, but something you tweeted recently about a week and a half ago kind of resonated with me in this fact that Jerry does not mind the spectacle of this. And if you think it's like he's embarrassed by people saying, well, Jerry's botched this or something, he's not. I think in his mind, hey, we'll come up with a good coach. We'll be fine. So, I mean, this could play out over several days or even weeks. And, of course, if he's got to wait. Now, Ed, just for we got the Detroit Lions situation. We got the Eagles situation. If you wanted to talk to Kellen Moore, again, they've missed their window on that. So if Jerry goes in the bunker and just doesn't do anything for a while, then that tells us something right there.
Well, I think he'll start the process. The NFL has really slowed these teams down in terms of making hires with all of the requirements that they've instituted in these hiring practices. And we mentioned a couple of them that they have to bring in, a couple of minority coaches. So it wouldn't surprise me if, like, Ron Rivera is brought in for an interview. He interviewed in Chicago. He interviewed with the Jets. So it wouldn't surprise me if they have a conversation with him or meeting with him. But yeah, it's gonna take a while. And I'm like I said, Jerry operates from the philosophy or point of view that he expressed long ago, which is, hey, the Dallas Cowboys can have the best there is in coaching. Now you can say, well, why don't you ever then have the best there is in coaching? Or so seldom do. But he doesn't believe in paying coaches, which makes me think he's not going to be willing to pay an unproven coach like Ben Johnson. Could Cliff Kingsbury wind up being somebody of interest? He's been a head coach, not a successful one. So I think he will be somebody of interest. Although if you watched the game last night, they really don't have a traditional running game. Nobody's since like week 14 has gotten more rushing yards from their quarterback than Cliff Kingsbury and Washington. But Jaden Daniels has a unique skill set early in his career. Dak used to be that kind of guy, not anymore. Not after all the injuries and at age 32. So I'm not sure how good a fit Kingsbury is, but he could certainly be a consideration once the Commanders are eliminated, and that could be this week because they're going to play the Lions. So we'll see. But yeah, Deion Sanders. Can you rule Deion Sanders out? I've been told no, and Deion has said the only way he would leave Colorado for an NFL job is to coach his two sons. Well, one of his two sons is Shedeur Sanders, who's going to be one of the top quarterback prospects in this draft, which the Cowboys are not going to be in a position to take in all likelihood without a major trade-up. And they're committed to Dak Prescott. They just made him the highest paid player in football and haven't begun paying that contract yet. So if that's Deion's prerequisite, I can't see that working. That would be an untraditional hire, an unconventional. So would Jason Witten. And I know this about Jason Witten, as you do. One of Jerry's favorite players ever. Loves him more than Tony Romo, which is hard to say. Been a very successful high school coach out in Argyle. Big jump from that to the NFL. Big jump from major college to the NFL, let alone high school. But I do know that when he hired McCarthy, he tried to get McCarthy to agree to put Jason Witten on his coaching staff because he sees him as the next Dan Campbell. And eventually Jason Witten could well be the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, just not sure now's the right time.
No, and hearing you say Campbell, just think about all the coaches when Jerry looks around, last night even. Bowles is on the sideline, who used to be on the staff in Dallas. Kellen Moore, Dan Campbell, Sean Payton was involved in the playoffs.
Dan Quinn.
Dan Quinn, of course. I mean, you can trace almost everybody back to the Cowboys. And of course, Jerry hasn't managed to like keep these guys in. You and I have spent the last 10 years talking about scenarios where he could possibly bring Sean Payton in. I think we've had to give that one up. Sean seems to be doing okay in Denver, although they didn't work out for him yesterday, but he's got a young quarterback who he likes. I guess the next thing for me, Ed, is okay, let's whether it's whoever it is, like I always like to look at the openings and try to rank which are the most attractive openings. And it generally, like last year, the Commanders honestly was one of the most attractive because they were going to have a great young quarterback. I honestly, they had a lot of things in place actually, and that's proven to be true. I don't know what people think of the Cowboys. They have a quarterback who's missed a lot of time, but it has been, an elite quarterback at times. They have an elite wide receiver, one of the best receivers, and they have probably the best pass rusher in the game. So there are things to like about the Cowboys. There are also things to dislike. And part of that might be, do you want to work with Jerry with all the things that come with that? So I guess I'm wondering, Ed, like as people look at this, and there are people like Rivera or whoever that just really want to get back in, and they're not going to be like worried about Jerry or anything like that. But
that was McCarthy.
Yeah, exactly. They just want in.
He'd been out for a year. He wasn't sure he was going to get another job. This was his only opportunity. It's the big stage. I'll put up with the rest. Yeah. I want to call my own plays. Okay, he wants Kellen Moore. All right. Kellen Moore seems like he does a pretty good job. I'll allow it.
Well, and this gets back to this, though. Would Tom Brady reportedly reached out to Bill Belichick. And I could see a lot of reasons why Bill Belichick wouldn't want to do UNC like that and leave and come work for Mark Davis and the Raiders. Would it be different if Jerry called to gauge his temperature? Because deep down somewhere in Belichick, he has to know that, he was embarrassed about what happened with Atlanta. And I think he was kind of embarrassed that he didn't have more opportunities. This, I think, getting the UNC job made him more attractive. It's like when you have a girlfriend, other people think you're more attractive or something. And so I just wonder if Jerry might reach out to him and what he would say in that instance. I mean, where do you rank the Cowboys job with the other 5 that are still open?
First of all, I would say relative to Belichick, that window's closed. And I checked on it today with somebody who went to North Carolina with him and believes he's fully committed, and there is nothing Jerry could do to change that. And I'm not sure Jerry would pay what right now is a $10 million buyout on top of paying Bill Belichick at the top of the coaching scale, because he's never believed in coaches making top of the market money working for the Cowboys, and he's made very few, if any, exceptions to that. He may have done it for Bill Parcells. So I'm not sure that Belichick is a viable possibility. The option buyout drops from $10 million to $1 million in June. You're not really in a position, if you're running an NFL team, to wait 6 more months to hire a head coach. So I don't really think that's going to happen. As far as the best jobs, I thought from the start, the one that was filled, New England, by Mike Vrabel, I thought that was the most attractive job. You've got, stable ownership, a flagship franchise with a history of recent success, a young quarterback in Drake May to build everything around, committed ownership. So that was the best job. That's gone now. I still think the Cowboys are high despite, talking to people with Belichick even before this decision was made, they questioned whether he would come here because he's all about avoiding distractions, eliminating distractions, and Jerry's a distraction creation machine. And they wouldn't get along from that point of view. Probably wouldn't love Jerry, being as public as he is and making personnel decisions like he does. So I'm not sure that was ever a great fit. But yeah, Dallas is still the Cowboys. It's still a flagship franchise with it attracts an enormous amount of attention. Do I think everybody wants to come coach Dak Prescott and thinks that the investment they made in him cap-wise is logical? No. I think a lot of people are going to look at that and say it's an impediment to building a winning team. But you also got a guy who's proven. He hadn't proven he can elevate his teammates and win against the best opponents in the playoffs, but he can get you there and give you the chance. Can you create, with your value, the scheme and the circumstances that will allow him to do that and succeed? There'll be plenty of guys who think they can do that. So I don't think they're going to be short of options because of the Cowboys. And who wouldn't pick this job over the Saints job? They're going to have cap problems. They're in a division that's pretty easy to win, you would think. Jacksonville's in a division where you can probably win, and you have a potential franchise quarterback who has been hurt constantly and hasn't, played to those expectations. So I would think the Cowboys would be more attractive than Jacksonville. Chicago might be a more attractive job. They have a number one franchise pick quarterback in Caleb Williams, and they're a flagship franchise. And the problem there obviously is you got 3 teams that all just won 11 games this year. How are you going to compete with that? So I think the Cowboys are probably the second or third most desirable job among those that are open at the moment.
All right. Ranking them, looking at it. I mean, it's McCarthy is out. And very interesting, Ed, because I think we thought there was, a way back for him, and there was an opportunity. And you and I just a little, more than a week ago, were standing right by him when he basically said something like, "Who said I wasn't going to bring him back?" I mean, He was kind of shooting that talk down. And like Jerry can do, though, the more time passes, the more you have a chance for something to happen, something that might surprise you. So I think, Ed, you've covered him long enough, and now I have, that nothing truly surprises us. It's just interesting how it played out. Like that it was kind of like this waffling thing, or Mike just kind of, again, those are interesting. It would be interesting to be a fly on the wall when he was like going to Mike and asking him about this and that, and why did you wait so long to go to the run game? It's almost like he was, what in the world were they going over during the week? Knowing this was the huge story hanging over their heads. So that's fascinating to think, Ed, like just the back and forth between Jerry and Mike this past week. And what they did, unfortunately, is just, they lost out on interviewing some of these potential hires. And, they may have messed up things for some of Mike's assistants that were just left kind of floating in the wind. But I think Jerry is someone, because he loves to talk about the franchise tag, right? So when there's something, when he has a deadline that goes to the 14th, he kind of likes to use that. That's his deal. And Jerry will also, after all this has gone on, he'll again remind us that he's okay with ambiguity, one of his favorite words in the world, right? That he's okay just kind of floating out there a little bit.
High tolerance for it.
High tolerance for ambiguity. But I would be very interested to see what's on his list. And the other thing, Ed, you and I both know, like, who he talks to is not always just like Steven or Will McClay or somebody else in the building or one of his kids. He has a tendency in these times to reach outside the building. And, even when the late, great Larry Lacewell wasn't working for him anymore, he might have been involved in some of the making. Barry Switzer, when it comes to the draft, Jerry would call him up. So even all these years later, after Barry was the coach. So it'll be interesting, Ed, because I can see Jerry getting on the phone with somebody like Belichick. And it sounds like from everybody you talk to, there's no chance that's happening. By the way, that guy you were talking to, Ed, we can bring him on the Doomsday sometime. I think I'm pretty familiar with him. But I think that's someone I don't think Jerry would hesitate to call up and bend his ear as he's making some decisions.
Yeah, that's what we talked to Stretch. I was talking to Stretch a couple of weeks ago, and he was like, "Who is Jerry talking to?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't know outside the building who Jerry relies on, for credible opinions. There are people in the agent game who are very influential in who gets what job as a general manager and as a head coach. So it's entirely possible that he would talk to them. Like, Bob Lamont is one of those people. He represents John Gruden. Don Yee represents, Don Yee represented McCarthy. He also represented Sean Payton. He also represented Jim Harbaugh. So he's no doubt talked to him as he was representing McCarthy. So I really don't know how to predict what Jerry's going to do from this point forward, but it would surprise me if they're starting at ground zero, as is the perception. They might officially be starting right now. I suspect they've been making contingency plans all along, and we'll see if they get it right, and we'll see what direction they go, because Jerry's really gone every direction except for the direction of hiring a young, unproven head coach. That's something I'm not sure he's ever done from outside his building.
Correct. Garrett was, homegrown Cowboy, and he knew him, and and obviously that was.
I kind of think Kellen Moore's that guy in this scenario.
Yeah,
except he got away.
Yeah, and Jerry could reel him back in, and the question will be: would Kellen want to come back? Like, you would think the answer would be yes, and especially I think he had a great relationship with Dak, but I don't know if he's totally wired to put up with all of this. I mean, the extra stuff that comes along with Jerry and the media here. I don't think the media is that tough to deal with, but even Mike, I think, remarked to you at some point, Ed. I mean, he acknowledged he was in Green Bay, where people, they have a huge amount of fans and interest, but I think that paled in comparison to what he was dealing with the Cowboys. And Kellen did not have to do that. Kellen talked once a week, perhaps, as an offensive coordinator, and really could just keep his head down and coach. This would become a whole different thing for him.
Well,
there's easier places to start.
People will say that they question, whether he can command the room, per se, because of what they've seen of his public persona, and he doesn't say a lot. And can he really command the respect of professional football players across the board, like a head coach needs to do? And I'll just tell you that it's hard to make that judgment because, and I guess the best example I could use is when Matt LaFleur left as the offensive coordinator on Mike Vrabel's staff. Somebody on his staff told me to go be the head coach of Green Bay. They said he's never going to command the room. This is not going to work. He's not that guy. And obviously goes there, inherits Aaron Rodgers, which is one of the most difficult personalities to deal with. And he's been one of the winningest coaches at the start of a coaching career that we've ever seen in the NFL. So I think that's a component that's hard to judge. And I wouldn't rule out Kellen Moore just because you don't think he has the right personality to be a head coach in the NFL, because it's different than what most of these coaches demonstrate. So we'll see. That's just one example, but it's definitely a different set of circumstances here. And somebody like Pete Carroll or John Gruden could definitely handle it without it being an issue of any kind. But is Jerry convinced that those guys can deliver this organization to a Super Bowl that's eluded this team for 29 seasons now? And you talk about people he's spoken to. I'm sure he's consulted with Bill Parcells. I'm sure he's talked to Sean Payton about what he should do and who he thinks is good and who they should consider. He'd be remiss if he wasn't involving them. He might even talk to Jimmy after all these years about it. So I don't know.
Did you see Jimmy's idea of swapping Tomlin for Mike McCarthy because things have gotten stale at both places?
That was an original idea, but I don't see that happening. And all indications are Mike Tomlin staying in Pittsburgh. So,
he could call Dan Campbell to find out about his coaches. I don't think it's not a mystery, by the way, about Aaron Glenn, and he's very familiar with him. Aaron Glenn having played in this state and spending a little time on the Cowboys roster at one point. So Dan Campbell was on the roster. So there's a lot of people he could call up. One little thing I was going to go back to, the Witten thing, and you and I both have known Jason for a long time, have great respect for him. You're totally right. Jerry would love to somehow pull that off. You remember somebody kind of tried to do something similar with, I think it was Josh McCown years ago, and they kind of floated it out, and everybody Yeah, and everybody kind of laughed at it, and so it kind of went away. And it was like he was going to go from, I mean, I forget where, like similar to what Witten would be doing. And I just think people were very impressed with him in a lot of ways. And of course, he played in the NFL for many, many years. Witten's the same way.
18 years. With
Correct.
18 years with a different offensive coordinator every year, so he knows every system.
Yes.
And he's in Minnesota now, and he's part of, that team, which obviously has played extremely well and exceeded expectations. And with Sam Darnold becoming a quarterback who throws for 35 touchdown passes, they're in a playoff game tonight. So, he'd be somebody I'd want to talk to if I was the Cowboys and had any interest at all in hiring the next up-and-coming young offensive guru.
I mean, if Jerry had his druthers, he might, try to bring Norv or Wanstead or somebody back.
Yeah, I guess Norv's available again. He went to the Raiders late in the season to work with his son there, but now obviously Antonio Pierce got fired, and the Raiders are looking to hire a coach as well.
Okay, lastly, Ed, let's talk about a timetable here. It's impossible to know with Jerry, but I want to get your expectation on how this will go from here on out. As you've noted, Jerry kind of likes owning news cycles, and he probably won't hesitate to let this thing play out a little bit if he needs to. And as you said, you've got to do the Rooney Rule. Somebody reported to CBS today that there's they've got to do their inclusive training. So I guess Jerry and everybody has to go.
I think it only takes like an hour though, or something.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You do their training, and then they'll be able to hire away. Just at one point, I always thought the Rooney Rule, and I think this, in the spirit of it, was a really good idea. I think sometimes it comes across as a sham because people that really don't have a chance at some of these jobs get interviewed just to check those boxes. We all know that happens.
Like New England this year?
Correct. Pep Hamilton and somebody else, that weren't even in the NFL.
Byron Leftwich.
I think the Rooney Rule, I heard you say something about Ron Rivera. I think the Rooney Rule as being like African-American coaches. So
it's minority coaches.
So so as a Latino coach, Rivera would check that box.
One of them, yeah. You have to have two. So, yeah. And I think Ron will be interested in this job. And I think he has a very specific idea of what you need to do to support Dak and make him successful in the postseason, having played against him as many times as he did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Dion thing would be the most entertaining. I don't know if you would want that. I mean, last time y'all were in the same room together, he kind of came after you a little bit, but you're okay with that. Yeah.
Well, Jimmy came after me a few times too.
Yeah, it happened. Yeah, it's happened. Okay, so in your mind, when will the Cowboys have a new head coach?
I mean, it's impossible to know because we're not sure of their interest in some of these coaches who are on staffs right now who are in the playoffs. So it's hard to tell. Like, are they going to wait out Ben Johnson? Is that somebody on Jerry's list high enough to justify waiting? Like, has he gotten the sense that Ben Johnson would be interested in here, and he thinks that he's a unique enough coach that he's worth pursuing and worth waiting and taking further risk for with the timing of this thing? I don't know. What about Steve Spagnuolo, the defensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs, who's won 4 Super Bowls in his system, but was a failed head coach with the Rams? He's been highly regarded by Andy Reid and others. So I think it's kind of hard to know. It would shock me if they did this sometime this week. I mean, they moved pretty quickly after they, made the decision on Garrett. They didn't announce it for his purposes, but they were at work behind the scenes, had told Jason that they were moving on and got to work. And I think Mike was hired like 2 days after they made the official announcement that Garrett was out. So I don't see him moving that fast in this situation. But Jerry's totally unpredictable, and if he has somebody on his list who's not traditional and is not interviewing with other people, and he has a real conviction about this person, Jerry could quickly meet the requirements and make the hire. But I think it's going to take a while.
Okay, there it is. And Ed, as my kind of like wild card candidate, that he might try to do this privately and not let any of us know. I think. Partly because he's at the University of Texas. I think that would appeal to Jerry. I think he could at least privately gauge Sark's interest. If that's a call to Sark or if that's a call to his agent, something along those lines. But that's I don't think that's the hire. But you know how these things go, Ed. Sometimes in these searches, you enjoy talking to different people and getting different perspectives.
Favors, right? You do people favors.
Yes.
If Jerry interviews Sarkisian, then he's a candidate for other jobs next year, automatically. Interviewed with the Cowboys.
Yeah. And I mean, even a coach that honestly to me had kind of faded. And I know this year they played in the Big 12 championship game, but let's not act like Matt Campbell has been a hot name in recent years. In fact, I think that's the first time in maybe the second time in school history they've won 10 games or something, and his name came up attached to one of these jobs. So there could be some interesting names that we're not thinking about. Ed and I will stay on top of it. Ed and I have been tweeting all day, reacting, and appreciate everybody. Appreciate Rogue Media Network and our man Zach for jumping in here with us at the last second to get this thing out. And we will be talking to you soon. Ed, any last thoughts, or are we good to go?
I think we're set.
Okay.
I can't think of anything that went unsaid.
Okay. In church, Ed, we'd say unspoken prayer.
Just more brainstorming about possibilities and what else can we do when we haven't directly been able to have access to Jerry and haven't seen any of their moves yet.
Yeah. Yeah. If we think of something else, we'll do a part 2 of this emergency. All right. For Ed and Rogue Media Network, I'm Matt Mosley. Good night. We'll talk to you soon.
We are Rogue Media Sports.